Hello and welcome. My name is Rowan Graining, a new co-host for Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. In this week's episode, we interview author and professor Daniel Rück about his book, The Laws and the Land, the Settler Colonial Invasion of Kahnawà in 19th-century Canada. We discuss the history of land, law, and colonialism in a community situated in what is today part of Canada, near the city of Montreal. We hope you enjoy. All right, welcome to Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. Today I am joined by Daniel Rück, who wrote The Laws and the Land, the Settler Colonial Invasion of Kahnawà in 19th Century Canada, which came out in 2021. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Your book covers the interactions between settler legal systems and Indigenous legal orders during the 19th century in what is today part of Canada. Could you give some context for the general state of affairs between the various governments present in Kahnawà at this time when the book begins towards the end of the 18th century?
Well, thanks again for having me on. I appreciate the question as well. It's the starting point for my book, which is the way that I framed the book was to talk about the big 19th century, which in historian language means that it spills out over onto the 18th and into the 20th century. But I wanted the starting point of the book to be well situated in a time when Indigenous people in this part of Canada, basically the Montreal area, were still largely self-governing and managing their own affairs under their own leaders and under their own laws. And so we're talking about here a fairly heavily populated part of Canada, the East Coast, essentially, the St. Lawrence Valley. And so the same would be true in parts of the United States where Indigenous people at this point, some of which were not yet colonized, many of which, especially in the American West, didn't have like a lot of experience with Europeans. And in the case of Kahnawà, they did have a long history of experience with Europeans, but and next to Canada's largest city, Montreal at the time. Today it's Toronto, but in those days it was Montreal. And so they did have a lot of experience with Europeans. They had a lot of experience with European understandings of things like private property and understandings of European ideas like monarchy. But they were still governing themselves under their own rules, under their own laws, and with their own leaders. And that over the course of the book changed. And so my book really traces all the different forces that came into play over the 19th century, so that by the end of the 19th century, around 1900, when the book ends, then this community is no longer able to govern itself in that way. Its own laws are still being talked about. Some people are still trying to assert them, but they're very much weakened. And the Canadian government has really attempted to squash any sense of sovereignty in this community. But I just want to say that it's not to contextualize this and to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. This community still today is very much asserts its own sovereignty and wants to reject, most people in the community really reject Canadian rule over it. And that's the case for a lot of Indigenous communities that assert their own sovereignty in all kinds of ways.
So that, like you were saying, there is kind of a trend there with interference. So in the book, the overall trend depicted is one of increasing interference from settler governments. In what ways did settler governments interfere with Indigenous sovereignty, and how did this change over the time period in the book?
Yeah, I mean, even I think interference, I played with all kinds of words as I was writing this book, because interference is one, right? And it's sort of like soft pedaling what happened. And so that's why I decided to go with invasion in the title of the book. Interference is certainly stuff that was happening as well. We could think about all kinds of other ways to describe the colonial violence that was inflicted on this community. But in terms of, I do use the word interference quite often because I think it's useful in a way that we're going to speak more about the methods of the Canadian government and how this interference happened. But when we think about the word, it really means like meddling in someone else's affairs and making sure that there are problems in the way someone else is doing things. And that really describes the sort of base starting point of the book, of the way different Canadian governments. At the beginning of the book, it's not, Canada doesn't exist yet. It's a British colony, or a series of colonies, and those colonies start to interfere in Kahnawà politics. And the first case that I bring up is this guy named Araguante, who is a Mohawk. He belongs to the community, but he's a bit of an outsider, and he doesn't want to obey. He doesn't want to be part of the way that Kahnawà is governed. He wants to make money. He's a capitalist. And he doesn't agree with the way things are happening in that community. And so instead of just registering his disagreement, as people had always done in the community and trying to affect change from within the community, he actually went to a Canadian court in Montreal and took some of his fellow Mohawks to court in a colonial court. And that had never been done before 1796. And so that's an important starting point for the book as well, to say, like, look, this is the first time when one Mohawk takes another Mohawk to court and tries to sue them. And it's an interesting case that shows these judges, these outsiders who are not Indigenous, who try to understand what the heck's going on in this community and are using a combination. They're trying to understand Indigenous law a little, because they're like, we got to understand it because we don't even know what's going on. But they're also trying to apply colonial law to this community that has never had it applied before. So that's just an example of the kind of beginning of the interference. And as the book goes on, it just gets heavier and heavier until in the late 19th century, then the Canadian government actually just goes ahead and replaces the government in Kahnawà with a new system of government against the will of the community.
You introduced this idea early on of effective inefficiency. Could you explain what this means and how it manifested in Kahnawà during the 19th century?
Sure. I got this phrase from the sociologist and lawyer Yael Berda. And so they're subject to this sort of what she calls bureaucratic cruelty. She called it, which, I think all of us have experienced a tiny slice of bureaucratic cruelty in our life when we're doing our taxes and such. But with colonized people, this is really next level. And I think we can use our tiny experiences, those of us who are not colonized in that way, we can use our experiences to try to understand the experiences of colonized people whose life becomes defined by that kind of frustration and uncertainty. And so the way that this was experienced in Kahnawà by people there was partly that as well. This the unexpected was constantly occurring. And so sometimes you would reach out to what was called the Indian agent at the time, which was the representative of the Canadian government's Indian department. And that person would act this way at this time, would act this way at this time, sort of very much dependent on that person. And that person had a lot of power over people. And in the Canadian history, that person, the Indian agent, had the power to stop people from leaving the reserve. In Canada, reserves are the name for reservations. So it's just a slight vocabulary difference. Another example I wanted to give you was when the Band Council in Kahnawà would try to get things done. They would reach out, they would pass resolutions as the way they were supposed to. They would try to institute bylaws. And in many cases, the Canadian government representatives just wouldn't get back to them, and they got no response. And then they would check again next year and try to do something. So basically, it was this government that wasn't able to operate because of the colonial conditions that it was under. And it's the kind of experience that a lot of colonized people around the world will recognize.
In the book, you describe how the settler colonial invasion has a visible impact on the landscape, seen in the fences, roads, lines, railways, and grids imposed upon the land. This is especially apparent in the chapters about industrialization. And in the introduction of the railroad and land surveys. Could you talk about the ways in which the settler colonial invasion affected the environment in Kahnawà?
This is, again, I think, a place where we can start talking about the framing of the book, because at the beginning of the book, in the late 18th century, the environment was like partly an agricultural landscape, partly a forested landscape. But it wasn't an industrial landscape yet, and the quarrying was just beginning. There are some large quarries in Kahnawà, which is related to industrial activity and canal building and bridge building that happened later. So that's an example of something that started at that time and had sort of minimal impact on the environment at the beginning, but then as Montreal industrialization heated up around, especially around the mid 19th century in Montreal, like many American cities, like Chicago, like other Canadian cities like Toronto, and other, I guess California at this point was just starting to experience its own colonial, settler invasion in the 1850s. With the explosion of cities, that unprecedented growth of cities, the world had never seen the growth of cities the way that happened at this time. So Montreal was one of those, and so Kahnawà was only about 10 miles outside of Montreal and was deeply impacted through this podcast is about railroads. So one of the impacts was a railroad that came. The trajectory was from upstate New York, and it was meant to connect with Montreal. And at the time, Montreal didn't have a bridge across the St. Lawrence River yet. And so the terminus of this railroad was in Kahnawà, where the train cars were then and locomotives were loaded onto a ferry and taken to the other side of the river to then go to downtown Montreal. So railroads were an important part of this transformation. But then as we go, there are many other impacts. There's other railroads that are then built. There's bridge building. And then I write in the book quite a bit about some of the impacts of railroad building on individual people in Kahnawà and how they were impacted when not only were their lands taken away, but they were very much the lands were very much degraded and changed by this industrial process. But just to bring this up to current times as well, because Kahnawà is so close to Montreal, it was deeply impacted by further bridge construction in the 20th century. Which now this very small Indigenous community has this sort of looming bridge infrastructure and approaches to the bridge above the village where people live, as well as really intense hydroelectric lines crossing its territory. And in the 1950s, then the St. Lawrence Seaway was built, and that cut right through the community as well and resulted in large territorial losses during that time. And if we want to think of these incursions in context, I think it's important to recognize that people didn't just sit back and let this stuff happen to them. People tried to resist, and one of those resistances was the Oka crisis in 1990, which even maybe some Americans would have heard of. I hope some of you have heard of it. It's a very important moment in Canadian history when people in Kahnawà and in Kanesatake, another Mohawk community, rose up to protect their land and block this bridge, one of these bridges as well, to try to put an end to this. So I would say that there's a kind of accumulation of of grievances that happens over time. And for your average person who just sees a blockade or sees Indigenous people trying to protest something, for them it comes out of the blue. But for Indigenous people who've experienced this over centuries, it's not coming out of the blue. This is like sort of the last straw in many cases.
Definitely. And throughout the book, you do describe the increasingly intrusive Indian laws and threats to Indigenous people's sovereignty. So what were some of the ways that you describe in the book that Indigenous people did resist that settler colonial invasion, specifically the intrusive laws, and tried to defend their sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess the short answer about what ways Indigenous people resisted, I would say, in what ways did they not resist? The methods of resistance that Indigenous people have used in North America across time have been incredibly varied, from everything from sending petitions and contacting their, writing strongly worded letters to their politicians, just like all of us do when we need something, to armed resistance, right? I was just reading about the Dakota who rose up against against the U.S. government in what's now Minnesota, and then paid dearly for that in terms of having their leaders hanged by the U.S. government and having their communities scattered around North America, including communities of Dakota that are still in Canada today as a result, sort of refugee communities. So I would say in the book, though, some of the forms of resistance, when I'm speaking about land surveying, and this isn't just Indigenous people, anyone who's against what a land surveyor is doing will know that you can interfere with land surveying stakes. It's very illegal. There are very big consequences for doing this, but people attempted to interfere with land surveyors' work when they were attempting to implement private property systems and trying to institute a new private property system in Kahnawà. So they would also lie to the land surveyor at times. And then there were other people who cooperated, thinking that was their best course of action. And so that's, in terms of Indigenous resistance globally, I think what you really see is this vast rainbow of options. Well, I wouldn't say options, of choices that people make with limited options, because under colonization, people always have very limited options as to what they can do to resist. And so people are making choices with those limited choices that are in front of them. And so I would say that there's always disagreement among people who are trying to resist, and some people choose this way and some people choose that way, but nobody can see the future. So it's not up to me, I think, to judge whether one course is correct or incorrect, but we can sort of see in hindsight that certain, certain ways of resisting worked better than others. And in other cases, no form of resistance worked. The power imbalance was just too great.
You bring up early on in the introduction, and discuss later in the book as well, this idea of a frontier or multiple frontiers, which is, of course, very big in American history. And you discuss this concept of multiple ongoing frontiers as spaces of contention and resistance, instead of a single frontier in a straight line, as some past historians have conceived of it. How does this framework of multiple frontiers shape your work and the themes of the book?
Yeah, this is an important concept for anyone that's even touched on American history is familiar with this, or if you've watched a Western, or this word is really batted around quite easily. And I think when most people conceptualize the frontier, they think of it as a line that sort of starts maybe at the Appalachian Mountains, and then it moves west over time as the Wild West becomes less wild, supposedly, and Indigenous people are fight wars with settlers, and then settlers eventually become the dominant force in those places, and then the frontier disappears. and that's it, right? Then the United States is there. And Canada also has a similar story of its own frontier, but it's a bit complicated by the fact that there's a big chunk of land between southern Ontario and Manitoba that's just a giant rock that no one can farm. So that was a bit of a complication for Canadian colonialism, and railroad building, by the way, as well. So the way that I was thinking about it for this book was, here I am writing about an Indigenous community that's not anywhere near that line, right, as it's imagined. This is an Indigenous community that's right next to an industrializing city. It's a community that has hundreds of years of contact with Europeans. And yet here we are having conflicts, right? Conflicts between settlers and Indigenous people. So I really wanted to conceptualize this frontier as being right here. Wherever we are, there's a frontier. Wherever Indigenous people are, even today, there's a frontier. And I wanted to think about it even more broadly than that, to think about frontiers inside myself as someone who's wrestling with ideas, wrestling with ways that I'm a colonized person, wrestling with ways that I have assumed certain racist ideas from childhood, wrestling with ways to be a good person in the world. So I consider that as a frontier as well. But here I just want to say too that when I think about frontiers, I think about this as also chronological, right? So I want to challenge not just the geographical idea of this, but I want to challenge the chronological idea of this, that the frontier is somehow over, right? That in 1891, when Frederick Jackson Turner said that the frontier was over, that was over. But I'm arguing that no, it never ended, and we're still in it. And so that's why some of my new research is very much around showing the continuity of these processes. In the Canadian context, we're seeing like a giant mining boom in Northern Ontario and Northern Quebec. That's really deeply impacting Indigenous people, causing a lot of road building. Not so much railroad building these days, but road building has similar impacts in history on Indigenous people. And we also have still a quickly expanding agricultural frontier in Canada, as well, as climate change changes our climatic conditions, our ecological conditions, and makes farming more possible in areas where it hadn't been possible before. So in terms of frontiers, I think that's one argument that I make, is that this isn't over. We're still very much in it.
In your book, you touch on a wide variety of topics, and you mentioned talking to different people, different organizations, going to different archives. So could you talk a little bit more about your research process and which sources and archives you were using when writing this book?
I mean, in many ways, I'm a fairly conventional historian, going to the archives and looking for interesting documents. But I think what makes what's really important, what I consider really important in my work, is the relationships that I have with the communities that I work with. And I think the discipline in general, the historical discipline, is sort of wrestling with these ideas the way a lot of his academic disciplines are wrestling with our legacy of having been doing extractive research for a long time, where anthropologists and historians will benefit from collaboration with Indigenous communities, or benefit from information that was produced under colonial circumstances. And then we make our nice little career on that. And then we don't need to have a lot of more contact with the communities. So I've been trying to not do that, and maintain a respectful but also a long-term relationship with Kahnawà and other Indigenous communities that I work with. And what that means for me is very much just maintaining connection, presenting my work in the community, making sure people know what I'm doing, and listening to the kind of feedback that I'm given. It also means doing work that people in the community hopefully find useful. So one of the things that academics sort of pride themselves in is just like looking for an interesting thing and then we're just like digging into it and being like, I'm really interested in this thing. It's so fascinating. But I'm trying to be a little bit less self-indulgent in my work, seeing as I'm investing a lot of years into this and hoping that it can serve another purpose other than just satisfying my own curiosity. And one example of that is my brand new research that I'm very excited about on the history of a little island in the St. Lawrence River off of Kahnawà that was actually taken from the community in the early 1900s and was sold to a private individual and went to the Supreme Court. But that research was instigated by an elder in Kahnawà who asked me, "What happened to St. Nicholas Island? Tell me. Your book doesn't talk about it." And so then I remembered that I had seen some files on this and was able to dig into it. And it's actually really interesting. And I'm glad I'm able to do that work.
Wonderful. Yeah, speaking of the 1900s and up to the current day, your concluding chapter begins with the sentence, "This book does not have a very satisfying ending, and for a reason," and goes on to describe how many of the harms described in the book continue throughout the 20th century and up to today. You also mentioned multiple times that the methods of oppression discussed in the book have current day counterparts. So how could your work on settler colonial invasion in the 19th century help us to understand colonial oppression today?
I think the main point that I'd want to make here is that a lot of us grew up with the assumption and still have the assumption that settler colonialism is in the past, that the frontier is in the past, that Indigenous suffering is in the past, and that land theft by settlers is in the past. And the point I really wanted to make with that ending was, aside from like apologizing for the fact that I didn't have a very interesting ending, is to say like what I'm describing is still going on. It may not always look the same. Like sometimes I think something can have a veneer so that it doesn't look like what things looked like in the 19th century. People are wearing different clothes. People are using different words. People are, invoking different laws, but many of the same things are still going on. And so some of the research that we're doing here on oil and gas exploration, on hydroelectric development, really the exploding mining regimes in all parts of Canada now and other parts of the world as well, related to electric cars and such, and battery technology. That we can see the same things happening. We can see Indigenous people being impacted. We speak to Indigenous communities, people in Indigenous communities who are saying like, this stuff is happening all around us. We're really concerned about it. No one talks about it with us. We're impacted. There's clear-cut logging happening around in Indigenous communities not far from where I live, who are deeply impacted, can't continue their traditional hunting and trapping practices. I think it's just a matter of looking around when I think about contemporary implications, even in a more urban context or a more southern context like California. I think we have to look around and think about like the impacts of this runaway urbanization, the impacts of climate change, and the kinds of agriculture that we're doing that are both possibly polluting in terms of the pesticides that are being used and chemical fertilizers that are being applied, as well as have heavy inputs of water that are required in areas that are don't have a lot of water actually. So I think when we think about the implications and the relevance of this kind of work for today, I think it's very much, it's really important to think about us as being like in the middle of it right now, rather than that this all happened in the past, in the deep past at some point.
So what then are some of the main things that you would want people listening to this conversation to take away from it?
I think one of the main things I would want to communicate is to think carefully about us me as an individual being rooted in a history of settler colonialism and thinking about what my relation is, not only with the injustices. When I think about my family, I think about one side of my family that was deeply involved in land taking, homesteading in Kentucky, in Illinois, but also to think about ways that my history is situated also in a future where I can hopefully be part of making positive change, where my children or the next generations and then the generations after that can find other ways of relating to nature and to each other, and to find ways to be on this land that are less damaging and more connected, ways of finding connections with each other and with the land. And the other point I would want to leave readers with has to do with a discussion we're having here in Canada, where there's a lot of talk about truth and reconciliation. And in Canada, that's very much about discussions about residential schools and the legacy of boarding schools, where Indigenous children were, by the tens of thousands, were taken away from their parents and from their families and placed into abusive conditions, and conditions where children weren't able to speak their language and practice their culture. And this led to all kinds of problems. And so we are dealing with that legacy in Canada. The United States has the same legacy with boarding schools for Indigenous kids. And one of the things people keep talking about here is reconciliation, and how we need to get together and we need to figure out how to have a good relationship. And what people talk about less is the truth part of it. And so what I want my role to be as a historian is to be as a truth teller who can play a role in making sure that we're not trying to have reconciliation before we even know the truth. And so I really want to encourage listeners to inform themselves about this history, so that then we can start to make steps to have better relationships with each other.
So for people who want to learn more, where can people find your book? And of course, where can they look for some of your newer works?
Well, I publish in academic journals, Canadian history journals, like the Canadian Historical Review, and I'm publishing a new essay soon in settler colonial studies. But for those of you who don't have access to academic libraries, you can buy my book, The Laws and the Land, in whatever bookstore you shop at. And it's also available as an audiobook now, which is read by Ganyantiyo Horn, who's a Mohawk actress from Kahnawà, who does a wonderful job with it. And that's available on Audible and a few other platforms as well.
All right, excellent. That is all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on Roundhouse Crosstalk. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you all for listening to this week's episode of Roundhouse Crosstalk, a podcast hosted by the California State Railroad Museum. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to check out The Laws and the Land by Daniel Rück. A link is in the description. You can also leave us a rating, like, and subscribe to stay up to date for our next episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.